Good evening and welcome to the fourth of our Thursday evening online Bible classes on the book of the prophet Isaiah. As we've said before, this is an awfully long book. This is going to be and is more of an overview or an introduction or what have you. We want to get a sense of the message of this book. So hopefully at the end of our 12 weeks together, we can say that we've at least got an idea as to what the book of the prophet Isaiah is all about. And wherever we find ourselves within it, we'll have an idea of how each little bit fits into the big picture, as it were. So let's begin by reminding us of this is our overall outline. I've tweaked it slightly to allow for the fact that we did not cover chapter 6 last week, but that's on the menu for this evening, and this is where we find ourselves. I've entitled this evening's session, The Vision and the Threat from Assyria. Maybe I should have put a comma in there so that anyway, you get the idea. So, yeah, last last week in our last session, we saw something of the glory in the latter days when the nations will go up to Jerusalem to learn the ways of the Lord. You remember that all the way back in chapter 2? We then saw something of the reason that God has rejected his people, the coming judgment of God against his people. And then we saw something there in chapter 3 of the consequences of divine judgment upon the corrupt leadership of the people. Then chapter 4 presents itself as another of those sort of little oases in the middle of a desert of suffering and judgment, in which the inhabitants of Jerusalem would once again be called holy. And then we had that delightful, well, maybe not quite so delightful, song of the vineyard of the Lord of hosts, followed by woes to the wicked. Yes, remind us of our historical context. Here's our timeline that we've seen before. And during the Isaiah setting his vision within the historical context of the reign of 4 kings of Judah, I want you to note particularly the name of Ahaz there. He's in the purple on those kings that are arrayed above the line. Ahaz. We're going to see a lot of him this evening. So, as we've said, lengthy volume. We're not able to look at each bit in detail, not by any stretch of the imagination. This evening, we've far too much to get through, so we will absolutely plow on. But let me encourage you to keep reading through the text. Maybe you want to reread the bits that we've looked at following the classes. I hope that you find time with yourself and our Father just to sit and read and think about the things. This evening, we're going to be focusing on a number of texts. But a good deal's going to be really in the form of a summary. Here's our outline for this session. We'll begin by looking at that vision, the vision of the king. Well, we won't actually see the vision, I'm afraid. We will look at Isaiah's description of the vision. Then we'll take a look at the threat from the north, say something of the Assyrian invasion. There'll be a word to the prophet. And then we will hear that a child is born. It'll be last orders for Israel, followed by some judgment on Assyria, then the root of Jesse and my strength and my song, which we will really look at almost only in passing, for such will be the time we'll have available by the time we get there. But we'll begin by looking at the vision of the king. Okay. Here's how chapter 6 begins. And technically, if we understand the first 5 chapters to essentially have been introductory, this is sort of where the book begins proper, as it were. Yep. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Well, just stop there for a moment, and we'll say, right off here that this is one of the most majestic passages in the whole of Scripture, and certainly one of the most remarkable visions seen by a servant of God. Now, I want us to think just for a moment of the national historic context. I think this is terribly important. The prophet begins there by saying, in the year that King Uzziah died. So I suspect, in light of the fact that the prophet began the book by saying that this is the vision that he saw during the reigns of, and he lists Uzziah, then he must have seen this prior to the death of Uzziah. But the death of King Uzziah was going to be very traumatic for the nation. He had been reigning upon the throne of David for 52 years. An awful long time. I know that the reign of our recent monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, exceeded those 52 years, but just bear this in mind. All of us here, up until the death of Queen Elizabeth II, knew her as our only monarch. She was the only monarch that we had known. In contrast, my grandmother, who died in, when was it, 1994, I think it was, she had witnessed 6 monarchs, beginning with Queen Victoria and all the way through to Queen Elizabeth II. But for all of us here, we only ever knew one monarch, and that was Queen Elizabeth II. And I don't know if any of you found your way to London. That's a little picture that I took. I was standing there on the Mall, and I'll tell you, it was a very, well, it was a very somber occasion. It certainly was there. I don't know that there was a dry eye on the Mall. It was very sad. The nation joined together in collective mourning, and whatever one might have thought of the monarchy, there was a sadness about all of this. We had known no other monarch, and so there was that degree of uncertainty. Uzziah had been a pretty decent king. I mean, not without his flaws, of course, but he was essentially a righteous man. The kingdom had grown during his reign, and his death would have disturbed many, not least the young prophet. But the trust and the loyalty of the people had probably been misplaced. And so, ourselves, just those few years ago when we witnessed the passing of our monarch who had reigned for all of our lives, there was that degree of uncertainty. There was, that thought of what will happen next. And maybe we're still wondering what will happen next. But, well, Uzziah had certainly been held in high regard, probably in too high regard. And the prophet and the people as well, of course, needed to learn to simply trust in Yahweh. And so, if they are asked, what would the future hold? Well, God will make it clear that he always holds the future. So we might also consider the death of Uzziah in the wider international context, as we will see. This is what Andrew Abernethy says in his book, The Book of Isaiah and the Kingdom of God. He said, in many respects, Isaiah provides a people living amid imperial contexts with a theological interpretation of these situations in the light of Yahweh's past, present, and future sovereign reign. And Isaiah, certainly, as we've already noted, seems to have free and easy access to the imperial courts, and thinking here of matters of kings. Much of what he has to say certainly provides this theological interpretation. And note in the vision that we just read, note the visual content. There was the temple, there was the throne, there was the pictures of evidence of holiness, there was the terror, there was the uncleanness, and then, of course, there is the uncleanness of the prophet, as we will shortly see, and of course there was the king seated upon his throne. Well, all of this, the vision itself, sets the scene for a number of prominent themes that permeate the book. For example, that of kingship and holiness and justice and righteousness. But consider for a moment the ironic context of this vision. Here is Isaiah saying, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne. This is in the year that King Uzziah dies. The prophet sees the Lord sitting upon a throne. This is not the throne of Uzziah. This is not the throne of David. This is the throne of God. And this throne is rightfully found within the temple. You remember Uzziah? The Chronicles tell us that when he, that is Uzziah, was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. For he was unfaithful to the Lord his God and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. That was not the role of a king. That was the role of a priest. And priests, as you know, were from the tribe of Levi. No king was from the tribe of Levi. They were from the tribe of Judah. So, in light of this king of Judah who had wrongfully served within the temple, Isaiah sees the Lord seated upon his throne, rightfully in the temple. There's mention in this vision of seraphim or seraphs. Now, these are mentioned nowhere else in Scripture. Literally, they mean the burning ones. You know, if we had more time, we would consider their identity a lot further than this. But for now, let's just understand that the meaning of the term is the fire is, or the burning ones. They seem to be rather similar to cherubs, or cherubim, if you prefer the older version of the term, but they have only four wings, and the seraphs here, or the seraphim, they have six wings. And what are they calling out to each other? Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Isn't that a marvelous thought there? The theme of holiness becomes really rather central to the message of Isaiah. So it is absolutely vital that he, from the beginning, from this opening vision here, he's mindful of the holiness of God. Now, the version that I generally use, the ESV, renders this phrase here as the Lord of hosts. If you've got the NIV, it will probably say Lord Almighty. The New Living Translation is rather interesting. It renders the phrase Lord of hosts as Lord of heaven's armies. And that's actually not a bad translation or transliteration, if you like, but it conveys this idea of the army or the armies of God, of whom he is Lord. And this power far exceeds that of any earthly king, whether it be Uzziah or Ahaz or Hezekiah of Judah or any of the other kings we might come across before the end of the evening. The power of the Lord Almighty far exceeds all of their powers put together. And he'll say the whole earth is full of his glory. You may recall, those of you who are avid students of the Gospel of John, that he refers to this passage in speaking of the glory of what we may call, or who we may call, the pre-incarnate Christ. He says he saw his glory, the glory of Christ, of Messiah. That is the glory Isaiah is seeing there in this vision in the temple. And the voice of the seraph, or is this meant to be the voice of Yahweh? I think it's that of the seraphs, these heavenly beings. It causes the temple to shake and be filled with smoke. And unless I'm terribly mistaken, when Isaiah sees this vision, as when any of the prophets saw the visions God showed them, they weren't simply as if they were pictures on a screen, that they were immersed in the whole experience, that it was as if they were there. And I get the idea that not only is Isaiah seeing these things and hearing these things, he's feeling these things as the temple shakes, and he's maybe smelling the smoke. Just an incredible experience. And the response of the prophet is, of course, woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. You know, it's only when we can envisage the Lord sitting upon his throne, only then might we begin to see things in their proper perspective. And I'm thinking of even the way we see ourselves. Only when we see the Lord upon his throne, only when we come to appreciate something of the sovereignty of God, are we able to see everything else in its proper perspective. That's why most people haven't got a clue. Even the experts that the BBC might parade in front of those who still watch it on their television screens, they haven't got a clue if they haven't envisaged the Lord sitting upon his throne. Without that understanding of God's absolute sovereignty, then we really have a distorted view of everything around us. Well, the prophet goes on, and we must go on rapidly here, that one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand this burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. He touched my mouth and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And then I said, "Here I am, send me." So the prophet, realizing that he's lost, that he's a man of unclean lips, dwelling in the midst of a people of unclean lips, here the seraphim, one of them flies to him with this coal. This is a cleansing fire. It's a burning away of all that was incompatible with the service of God. Isaiah has acknowledged his spiritual poverty, if you like. He's very aware of his sin, and God takes care of it. I think here is another truth, that effective service is only possible when we first acknowledged our failings and had them dealt with by the grace of God. We could say more of that. We've no time to do so. For next of all, we come across this commission from the Lord. And the mission that is given to the prophet is a rather unusual one. We're not going to read it all. You've got it there in the text. And you may recall that these words are quoted by Jesus in reference to those of his day not understanding his teachings. So it's going to be a difficult mission. The more that he speaks, it seems, the less the people are going to understand. But they need to hear the words of the Lord. I don't know whether the prophet is regretting having been so willing and eager to serve, but he certainly seems rather concerned, for he says, "How long, O Lord? How long is this to go on for?" Well, one thing is clear. His work was going to be lengthy, and it would continue essentially until the nation is destroyed. But there at the end of this passage, there in chapter 6, at the end there is a glimmer of hope, the saving of a remnant. Not all will be lost. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 6, and I've said we want to get through to the end of chapter 12. So this is the point at which we absolutely need to fasten our seatbelts, because well, the next 6 chapters, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, really ought to be taken as a single unit, though there's a huge amount of material here. They deal with the threat from Assyria and what is sometimes known as the Syro-Ephraimitic War. I'll explain that in 2 ticks, but the final chapter is a song of thanksgiving and assurance. But their future hope, just like their present security, rests entirely in the hands of their God. So here's the setting. Now, I've said you need to fasten your seatbelts. You also need to put on your thinking caps. I remember that's a phrase I've not heard for a while. We used to have to do that at school back in the day, but we need to do it tonight because we've got to look at a little bit of history. But fear not, for this is jolly exciting history, okay? The prophet begins by saying that in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. So let's introduce the characters. That might be helpful just to get a little bit of a feel for what it is that's going on here. First of all, there is Ahaz. In the days of Ahaz, he is the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah. You knew all of that, didn't you? This is what the Chronicles have to say about him. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done, but he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He even made metal images for the Baals as he made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom and burned his sons as an offering, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. So, in other words, Ahaz was a bad egg. Yep, all the way through. I mean, worse than that. Absolutely atrocious was his behavior, to the point that he seems to have offered his own children to this probably to the pagan god Molech, and that valley of the sons of Hinnom, that's Gehenna, from which the pictures of hell are taken. So, yeah, that's Ahaz. That's who he was. Okay. So these the first of our three main characters here. Then we have Rezin, the king of Syria. His capital is in Damascus. And then we have Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel. That's the king there of the northern kingdom. Okay, so those are the three characters. Looking at the historical setting, it is now about 734 BC. Okay, Ahaz is reigning in Jerusalem. So the map on the right, it's not a terribly, I mean, it's a decent enough map, but it's very small. Can you see I've just circled Jerusalem there, just to put everything into some sort of perspective there. Capital of Judah, southern kingdom there, colored in the purple. So, yeah, Ahaz is reigning in Jerusalem. Rezin reigns in Damascus, and Pekah reigns in Samaria. There they are, both. Samaria, the capital of Israel, the northern kingdom, sometimes known as Ephraim. And then there is Damascus, the capital of Syria, sometimes known as it is on this map in the orange as Aram. Okay. Well, so there they are. Those are the principal characters. That's where their thrones are. Together, Rezin and Pekah come against Jerusalem, against Ahaz. Now, this alliance is generally referred to as the Syro-Ephraimitic alliance. And so we speak of the Syro-Ephraimitic War. And that phrase comes from Syria and Ephraim. Syria and Israel, as we've said, often known as Ephraim. So the Syro-Ephraimitic alliance was the alliance of Rezin and Pekah who came against Ahaz in Jerusalem. And that's what the text says in 2 Kings chapter 16. Rezin, king of Syria, Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to wage war on Jerusalem, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not conquer him. Okay, so we've got that picture, I hope, in our mind of this northern alliance coming against Jerusalem and Judah there in the south. Elsewhere in the Chronicles, we're told that Pekah, king of Israel, remember, there in Samaria, killed 120,000 from Judah in one day, all of them men of valor, because they had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. Others also, other neighboring countries, took advantage of the situation, began raiding towns and villages in Judah. For the Edomites had again invaded and defeated Judah and carried away captives, and the Philistines had made raids on the cities in the Shephelah and the Negev of Judah, had taken Beth Shemesh, Ajalon, Gederoth, Soko and its villages, Timnah with its villages, and Gimzo with its villages, and they settled there. All of those there situated in the hill country of Judea. So you can understand, for those there in Jerusalem, in the southern kingdom of Judah, following the death of Uzziah, following the reign of Jotham, which was fairly non-eventful, and then into the reign of Ahaz, they are suffering this immense turmoil. There is conflict from the north. The neighboring countries are invading and taking over a number of their towns and cities. And well, why did all of this happen? This happened that the Lord humbled Judah because of Ahaz, king of Israel. For he had made Judah act sinfully and had been very unfaithful to the Lord. This is one of numerous passages within the prophets that speak of, and elsewhere, as we see, that speak of the responsibilities of those in leadership positions. Because of Ahaz, he had made Judah act sinfully. That's not to take anything away from personal accountability, but the kings had particular responsibility. Leaders have particular responsibilities over those whom they are supposed to serve as leaders. And what we're seeing in all of this is the hand of God at work. It wasn't all about Syria. It wasn't all about Israel or Ephraim or this Syro-Ephraimitic alliance. It wasn't all about the Edomites that are mentioned there and the Philistines. They were not the ones running the show, even if they thought they were. This is all the hand of God. It all happened for the Lord. Yahweh humbled Judah. He is the one, always is the one in control of everything. Oh, what about the response? Well, the response when to this incursion from the north, when the house of David was told Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the leaves of the forest shake before the wind. Isn't that a splendid picture there? You've got the idea, yes, of how their hearts are shaking. This alliance between Syria and Ephraim, but Syria and Israel, is making Ahaz and the people tremble. It's their own doing, but still they trembled. Isaiah did not tremble. But then, of course, he had seen the king. He knew who really reigned supreme. So God speaks through the prophet Isaiah. The Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. Well, it's a meeting here between the prophet and the king of Judah himself. It's a very personal meeting. Isaiah takes along his son because God tells him to do that. And presumably the purpose of the meeting is to set the king's heart at peace, and warn him against seeking help from any other than God himself. We ought to say something about Shear-Jashub, the son of the prophet. The prophet and his children. He tells us in the next chapter. He says, "I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Sion." And Shear-Jashub, his name means a remnant shall return. You've probably got that in a footnote in your Bible, haven't you? And this remnant is presumably a remnant of Judah. Other theories are available, but I think it's speaking of a remnant of Judah returning to the land, returning to God. Yeah, well, either way, I think the idea is that this physical remnant will be symbolic of one that is spiritual. And that's an idea that we see played out elsewhere through the book. Well, you're going to have this meeting with the king. What are you going to say to him? Be careful. Be quiet. Do not fear. Do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands at the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah, because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, "Let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves and set up the son of Tabeel in the midst of it." Thus says, so the basic message to Ahaz is take it easy. Corporal Jones would probably say, don't panic, He'd say a few other things too, perhaps. But the idea here is Ahaz, take it easy. There's nothing to be worried about, even though Judah is under attack and Jerusalem is ranked very high on the hit list, or rather Ahaz himself is. There's no reason to be alarmed. He speaks of Rezin and Pekah, although he doesn't name Pekah. He calls him rather derogatory, I think, the son of Remaliah. They are both referred to as these smoldering stumps of firebrands. They were like the remains of two burned out torches. They were history. They're saying, let's go up against Judah and terrify it and conquer it for ourselves. Here's the motive. Ahaz had presumably refused to join their alliance against the even mightier power of Assyria. And so they wanted to replace Ahaz with this son of Tabeel, whoever he was. Yeah? He certainly wasn't a son of David, but this was going to fail. They would not be able to conquer him. For thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. God was going to thwart their plans. However mighty and powerful they might have seemed to be, God was going to thwart their plans. And the remainder of this message basically asserts that neither of these kings and their territories are a match for God. As we've said, they were history. But God would preserve a remnant. Shear-Jashub, a remnant will return. You may remember words that the prophet spoke in the very beginning of the opening chapter of his book, where he said that if the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom, become like Gomorrah, but a remnant would return. Okay. Now we're coming on to the lead up to what is one of the best known passages in the whole of the book of the prophet Isaiah. And we've got to move on. So keep those seatbelts fastened. We are moving on. Here is the sign. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Presumably here, of course, through the prophet. He says, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol, as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. And so the Lord speaking through Isaiah, said, hear then, O house of David. Is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? So this seems to form the beginning of a new message. Ahaz is being spoiled rotten. God is bending over backwards to give this man, this terrible man, assurance of his presence. So he says, ask a sign of the Lord. Name your sign, no restrictions whatsoever. And maybe, you could think of what kind of sign you might ask for. I mean, it could be absolutely anything at all, no limits. But Ahaz, he seems to don his holier than thou hat, and he refuses to put the Lord to the test. I mean, what arrogance! The fact that the Lord had told him to ask for a sign is besides the point. I mean, how sickening is it to hear this infidel plead the cause of the one in whose face he constantly spat? What hypocrisy! How absolutely pathetic. And so Isaiah, if you can picture the prophet Isaiah at this point, he seems like he's fuming. I mean, I think there's steam coming out of his ears, as it were. I mean, he's about to boil over here. And he says, hear then, O house of David. Now, whether that's intended to be a little sarcastic, because Ahaz was certainly not behaving like a descendant of David. But he says here, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Kind of like, whether you like it or not, you're jolly well getting one. So these words that I suspect most of us probably first encountered from the first chapter of the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew there in the New Testament. These words were seemingly first spoken almost in anger, responding to the arrogance of King Ahaz. Therefore, the Lord will give you a sign, like we said, whether you want it or not. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And there we go. And he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose kings you dread will be deserted. So regardless of the arrogance of Ahaz, the king is the king, the king of all heaven and earth is going to give him a sign anyway. He didn't want one, but he's jolly well going to get one. Now, the sign has to do with a child, a son, and he will be called Emmanuel. When he's old enough to discern good and evil, he will be eating curds and honey. Before then, the Northern Alliance, along with their land, will be destroyed. So, what I think is difficult for us to do, and I've already seen a question here in the comments. Who was the child born as a sign at the time of Ahaz? What did it mean at the time? So that phrase there, at the time, suggests that we have in mind some other future fulfillment. Of course we do, because we've probably first encountered this passage, as we've already said, from the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. But we're looking at Isaiah here, and I'm not going to ignore that. I'll say something of that in a moment. We're looking at Isaiah here, and within his context. And so before this child, whoever this child might be, is going to be, but by the time he's old enough to discern good and evil, this Northern Alliance will be destroyed. Now, it is difficult because we can't, it's hard for us to think of this without thinking of its use in Matthew chapter 1. So we don't have time to really. I mean, we could spend an entire evening on these few phrases here. The word used in the Hebrew for virgin is a word that doesn't technically mean virgin. It means, and it can mean virgin. It can also just simply mean young woman. But the assumption is it's a young woman of marriageable age, and so likely to be a virgin. When the Septuagint, the Hebrew text, was translated into Greek in about the sort of 2nd or 3rd century BC, the word used was the word Parthenos, which does mean virgin. So that's very useful. Later, in the beginning of the 2nd century AD, in a revision of the Septuagint, a different word was used, but just take that as it is for now. What we're faced with here is, I think, a classic example of a dual fulfillment. There are a number of times, and Matthew seems to be particularly good at this. There are a number of times where a passage in the Hebrew scriptures, generally within the prophets, a passage has a direct relevance and fulfillment, perhaps, within the time in which it is written, but also has, if you like, something of a secondary fulfillment that we probably would not have realized, but a secondary fulfillment in relation to the coming of Messiah. And that's exactly what we have here. So all I want to do now, because I do want to press on to look at a few other things here before we finish our time this evening. We have here a woman that must have been known, presumably, to both Isaiah and the king. She may have been the wife of Isaiah. She might have been a second wife of Isaiah, possibly following the death of the first. All of this is pure speculation. We don't know, other than that she was a woman known to both the prophet and the king, and that the birth of this son would be known by both. He was to be called Emmanuel. He was to be called God with us. And it would fit what we've already read from chapter 8 and verse 18 of the children of Isaiah being given us signs and wonders, as it were. It would fit that that this may have been another son of the prophet Isaiah, but I'm not certain of that. But the whole point is that within a few years, before the boy knows, so surely this necessitates a primary fulfillment during the time of the prophet Isaiah, during the time of King Ahaz, unless we should read, you know, over 700 years before, then that would just not make any sense if it only had the one fulfillment with which we're familiar from Matthew chapter 1. So the child was to be noticed. He would be known, he was to be noticed, and his presence would be a sign that God was with them, that the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. That's all I'm going to say on that at the moment. We'll maybe return later if anybody has any questions in a few minutes, but when we come to the end of our session here. But we absolutely need to move on if we may. So in all of this talk of the threat from the north, Assyria is going to play a part. Verses 17 to 25, that's of chapter 7, speak of certain punishment for Judah. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people, upon your father's house, such days as haven't come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. Now, this is the first mention of Assyria within this book, and they're going to play a very significant role. The nation of Assyria. Do not confuse Assyria with Syria. Very important. Ahaz had insisted upon calling on Assyria for help. Here's a text which would be useful there from 2 Kings chapter 16. Ahaz sends messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. He is the first Assyrian king to be mentioned by name in scripture. Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, that's Tiglath-Pileser III, of course, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, sent a present to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria listened to him. The king of Assyria marched up against Damascus, took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Rezin. Okay, so Ahaz is not trusting in Yahweh. Yep, Ahaz is trusting in Assyria, particularly Tiglath-Pileser III, old TP3, as you may know him affectionately or otherwise. In calling upon Assyria for help, Ahaz is drawing attention to himself and to the relatively remote kingdom of Judah. In fact, F.F. Bruce, in his book Israel and the Nations, basically suggests that Tiglath-Pileser, with his Assyrian army, was going to march west anyway, even without Ahaz's plea for help, and it may well be that he simply attracted attention. Ahaz's request will ultimately ruin Judah, both physically and spiritually. His policies would lead to mass conflict and deportation under a later king of Assyria, under Sennacherib. So Assyria is going to come. Assyria is going to make their presence known. As another writer said, this is E.J. Young in his commentary on Isaiah. It's a splendid 3-volume work. He says, Ahaz has asked for the king of Assyria. Well, he shall have the king of Assyria. You don't always get just what you ask for. Well, that's a hard lesson they're going to have to learn. And so Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came against him and afflicted him instead of strengthening him. For Ahaz took a portion from the house of the Lord, and the house of the king and the princes gave tribute to the king of Assyria, but it did not help him. I mean, not only was Ahaz a complete and utter bad egg, he was a buffoon. He was a raving idiot, and a lot more besides. But we probably shouldn't use words like that. Now, in that day is a phrase repeated 4 times in this, the next part, the latter part of chapter 7. Basically, the Lord is also the Lord of Assyria, although they don't know it, and he will entice them to battle. As the prophet said, in that day, the Lord will shave with a razor that is hired beyond the river with the king of Assyria. The head and the hair of the feet, it will sweep away the beard also. The idea is that the razor is hired. Ahaz foots the bill, but God will use Assyria in judgment against him. And well, there we go. We are going to move on, but I think we're probably not going to get finished. There's far too much, and we're skipping over far too many things, but you're being terribly well behaved. So we'll move on to the next little section where we will read of Assyrian invasion. So it kind of carries on this idea. Ahaz has gone to Assyria pleading for help against this northern alliance, this Syro-Ephraimitic alliance. He was a fool for doing so. All along, he should simply have trusted in God, but he thought he knew so much better. He thought he was an expert in international diplomacy. Reminds me of some people I've read of more recently. But anyway, we at the beginning of chapter 8, we find the sign of Maher-shalal-hash-baz. Yes, I actually had a zebra finch that I called Maher-shalal-hash-baz. He froze to death. It was whilst I was a student. And it's a long story. But anyway, the Lord said to me, the prophet says, take a large tablet, write on it in common characters belonging to Maher-shalal-hash-baz, and I will get reliable witnesses, Uriah the priest, Zechariah the son of Jeroboam, to attend for me. I went to the prophetess. She conceived and bore a son. And oh, pardon me, we'll do that. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz, for before the boy knows how to cry, my father, my mother, the wealth of Damascus, the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king. Same sort of thing going on here. Another one of his sons being used here as a sign. Yeah, Maher-shalal-hash-baz literally means quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil. You'll have something like that, I'm sure, in the footnote in your Bible. J.B. Phillips renders this in 4 simple words: quick pickings, easy prey. Yeah, that's handy, isn't it? So 9 months or so later, Isaiah has another son. The name is given along with the reason. The end is nigh. Syria and Israel are going under imminently. Now everything begins to make sense. The next section speaks of the power of Assyria, under the power of Yahweh, of course, and beyond the power of Ahaz. You'll find it there in chapter 8. It's a rather graphic picture that you need to read through and picture. He speaks there of the waters of Shiloah that flowed gently. They've been rejected, and so in their place are coming the waters of the river, that's Euphrates, mighty and many. And it's Yahweh who is bringing them, for he is in control. So the idea seems to be Ahaz has chosen not to learn the easy way. He wants to learn the hard way, and it is the mighty and full waters of the Euphrates, Assyria. Assyria is going to come and get them. Very graphically there. Let's see. We've got to wrap this up in just a moment, and we will do so. Stay tuned if you can for another 2 minutes. He speaks there of it rising over its channels, going over its banks, sweeping on into Judah. If Ahaz thought that Tiglath-Pileser and the Assyrian army could be restrained, he was mistaken. And there's this very graphic picture. He speaks of it reaching even to the neck, the graphic portrayal of a surrounded Jerusalem with apparently no hope for survival. This is Judah in the days of Hezekiah. This is Emmanuel's land. One wonders, has Assyria gone one step too far? Well, yes, they have, because their day too will be coming. There is a word to the prophet next in chapter 8 there from 11 to 15. There's a warning and an encouragement. He's to fear nobody but God alone, regardless of what conspiracy theories might be doing the round. God is to be the rock of his refuge. To those who flee and run from him, they will trip and fall, but Isaiah must learn to stand steadfast and trust only in the words of God. The next few verses speak of the need to preserve the teachings that God has given to the prophet. There the prophet speaks of his disciples and how that his message was to be preserved for future generations. Hence, here we are today, over 2,500 years later, reading these things. And oh, so much more could be said. But this is a picture in the remainder of chapter 8, a picture of those who abandon the ways of God. They will roam through the land aimlessly, greatly distressed and hungry, speaking freely and contemptuously against their king and their God. Everywhere they look will be darkness and gloom. They'll be thrust into thick darkness. This is Israel, and this is Judah. And as far as they're concerned, from where they were, the worst was yet to come. Tiglath-Pileser III may not invade Judah, but one of his successors, Sennacherib, does. Well, this sets the scene for one of my favorite texts in the whole of Scripture, but alas, we're going to have to leave it there, in the darkness and the gloom, thrust into thick darkness, until we come together again, Lord willing, same time, same place, same channel next week.